So when we talk about Marie Antoinette, the image that immediately comes to mind is usually one of two things.
Right, two extremes.
Exactly. On the one hand, you have the gilded archduchess,
Yeah.
the absolute extravagant.
Cakes and diamonds, yeah, whether they're real or not.
And on the other side, you have that final moment,
Mm.
the guillotine, the swift, chilling end of a fallen queen.
And that's precisely the problem with how we usually frame her story, that final minute. It's what the revolution wanted us to see. It's what history tends to focus on. But when you really dig into the sources, the real horror, the historically significant horror, isn't in that one moment. It's in the calculated, systematic cruelty of the months leading up to it.
Okay, let's unpack that. Because you're suggesting this wasn't just,
Yeah.
Accidental collateral damage from a chaotic revolution.
Oh, not at all.
This is a consciously engineered process.
It was a conscious political program of ruin. We're talking about her transition from a sovereign, a figure defined by the strictest protocol in Europe, to what the sources chillingly call a body to be inspected.
A body to be inspected.
Wow. The revolutionary state knew that to truly legitimize itself, it couldn't just execute the queen. It first had to convert her private life, her grief, her role as a mother, into public evidence.
Into political pedagogy. That's a striking term you used.
It's exactly what it was. They weren't just punishing her. They were using her suffering to teach the people a lesson.
A lesson about the absolute irreversible collapse of the old world.
Precisely. They had to systematically break her down, physically and psychologically, right in front of the public. So our mission for this deep dive is really to analyze those sustained attempts to break a person into pieces that a crowd could recognize and punish.
We're tracing that path then, step by step, from the golden halls of Versailles to the dim stones of her final cell.
And understanding the intent behind it all. The cruelty wasn't random, it was the whole point. The sheer scale of the fall is just staggering to comprehend. She starts her life as an Austrian archduchess.
Right, raised in the Habsburg court, which was all about structure, protocol.
Hyper-structured. Then she's transplanted through an arranged marriage into the French court at Versailles, which was, if anything, even more suffocating, a life of public performance.
And she's married to Louis XVI, who, by all accounts, was not a man who wanted the crown.
No. He lacked the political will, the decisiveness needed for that moment in history.
Which must have made her position even more dangerous.
It did. Because with a weak king, she became the focus. Every dress, every party, every perceived misstep was amplified. Her public performance, which was her job, became the very thing the revolutionaries used against her.
Her name just became shorthand for excess.
For everything that was wrong with the old regime. It was powerful, effective propaganda.
And of course, the initial anger was about money, about the perception of aristocratic greed. But by the time she's a prisoner, the charges are much, much darker.
Oh, they had to be. To justify what came next. Wasting the treasury was one thing, but that quickly escalated.
To treason.
To treason, to corresponding with foreign enemies of the state, which is a very real threat to them. But even that wasn't enough. They needed something to utterly destroy her.
The incest charge.
The most vicious accusation imaginable, as the sources call it. Crimes against her own children.
And that wasn't just a legal tactic. That was a political bomb.
It was.
Yeah.
The revolution based its legitimacy on this idea of, moral purity, of virtue.
Contrasting with the supposed corruption of the monarchy.
Exactly. So if you accuse the queen, the ultimate symbol of that old world, of a crime that monstrous, that unnatural, you place her completely outside the bounds of humanity. You kill any sympathy the public might have had for her.
So let's trace that moment of the fall, the storming of the Tuileries Palace. Everything changes in an instant for her.
The physical space itself is transformed. The sources detail this so vividly. Rooms that were once governed by strict protocol and image are suddenly just evidence.
And the people change too. The servants are gone.
Replaced by guards. By men who just yesterday might have been taking orders, and now they see her as an object of revenge.
So that power dynamic just completely flips.
A total reversal.
Yeah.
The environment goes from deferential and structured to hostile and scrutinized. Her private spaces, the very places where you maintain your dignity, are instantly violated.
But what about the children? How do they process this?
Yeah.
Going from a palace to this?
It's just utter confusion for them. The memoirs talk about this bewildered state. The eldest daughter, Marie-Thérèse, she tries to cling to her old routines.
Reading, embroidery.
Little acts of normalcy to fight the chaos. The youngest, the Dauphin Louis Charles, he just clings to a routine to stop himself from panicking. For a while, they are still together in the temple, and there are these small moments of domestic life.
But that couldn't last.
No. And then comes the moment the sources all call the first irreversible wound.
The execution of the king.
She's locked away in the temple, but she hears it all. The carts, the roar of the crowd, the drums, and then that sudden, deafening silence. And the sources say that sound registered as a physical wound, something that would never close. It was the moment she became completely isolated.
She's no longer a queen consort. She's not even a political player anymore.
Correct. From that point on, she is untethered. She's not a person to be negotiated with. She is simply evidence in a new narrative and her personal grief, completely irrelevant to the political machine that was just getting started.
So she's stripped of her status, her husband's gone, and she's confined with what's left of her family. The months after that are just this steady, institutional narrowing of her world.
Right, from the Tuileries to the temple prison.
And the temple was chosen for a reason.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just any jail. It was a former medieval fortress of the Knights Templar. The symbolism was potent, the overthrow of an old feudal power. It provided rooms, sure, but it was what the sources call custody without kindness.
So how did that actually feel? What was the day-to-day difference?
The entire support structure of her life was inverted. The footmen, the ladies-in-waiting, all gone, replaced by sentries.
Armed sentries, not servants.
Exactly. Soldiers of the Republic, they're 24/7. The banquets of Versailles are replaced by strict rationing, and supervision becomes total surveillance. Every single moment is witnessed and recorded.
And you mentioned this accumulation of cruelties wasn't just neglect, it was deliberate. The sources are specific about what this did to her physically.
Heartbreakingly specific. You can track the decline of her body as a direct result of state policy. She's rationing coarse prison bread. She has a wound in her side, an abscess probably, that just goes completely untreated for weeks.
The pain must have been constant.
Debilitating. And then there's her hair. Under the extreme stress and malnutrition, it starts to lose its pigment, turning white at the roots. It's a visible, undeniable sign of her suffering.
And it goes deeper than that. This isn't just cosmetic.
Not at all. We're talking about systemic physical failure. She develops swelling in her limbs from the poor diet. And as we mentioned, the sources are very clear about the unmanageable menstrual bleeding. With zero medical care, this leads to severe anemia, chronic weakness.
How do we know for sure this was a targeted strategy and not just, a chaotic prison system falling apart? Where's the proof of intent?
That's a crucial question. The proof is in the political context and the official records. Prison authorities were given instructions to remove any trace of comfort or respect.
So it was policy.
It was policy. The idea was to reduce her to the base necessities of life, to create a public spectacle of the sovereign's collapse. The visual contrast between the old queen in silks and this prisoner struggling for basics was a powerful piece of propaganda. The deprivation itself was the message.
And this was all amplified by what was happening outside the prison walls.
A constant feedback loop. The revolutionary press was churning out pamphlets, crude caricatures, obscene jokes, all painting her as a monster.
Which then filters down to the jailers themselves.
It fuels their behavior. It blurs the line between their duty and their desire for cruelty. Mockery becomes routine.
They realize their proximity to her is a form of power.
Immense power. They'd make vulgar comments about her body. They'd demand she explain her private routines. These were men who had been told for months that she was the source of all their problems, and now they had her cornered. It was vengeance under the guise of duty.
Which brings us to the most insidious part of this, how they weaponized her physical decline.
This is maybe the clearest proof of the calculation behind it all. The combination of chronic pain, malnutrition, and the systematic denial of sleep guards would deliberately wake her multiple times a night.
It creates a state of cognitive breakdown.
Exactly. So when they interrogate her, she's exhausted, she's in pain, she can't remember a specific date or a minor detail.
And instead of seeing that as a result of their own abuse,
They twist it. They seize on those very lapses and present them as evidence. Her inability to recall a name is proof she's lying. Her confusion is proof of a vast conspiracy. It was a vicious, calculated cycle. Degrade the person until they falter, and then use their faltering as proof of their guilt.
so if the physical abuse was an attack on her as a person, the next stage was an attack on her as a mother. The state decided the children needed to be re-educated.
Right. The revolutionary government saw the children, especially the young Dauphin Louis Charles, as powerful symbols. They couldn't just be left with their mother. They had to be repurposed.
Her family bond wasn't a private matter. It was a political
The
target.
primary target.
And the taking of her son. The sources make it clear this was a brutal public act.
It was pure spectacle designed to show absolute power. Armed men came into the cell in July of 1793. The Queen. She just fought back with everything she had. The records say she scratched, bit, and shouted. She held on to that little boy for 2 hours. And her fear, you can feel it in the accounts, it was about more than just his safety. It was a final, absolute severing of the last tether of ordinary family life.
When they finally took him.
Her cries, they said, echoed through the temple for hours. It was the erasure of her identity as a mother.
And the man they chose to be his new guardian, this Antoine Simel, he was selected for a very specific purpose.
He was a shoemaker, a tradesman described as being of low repute. He wasn't a caregiver. He was an instrument of cruelty. His job was simple. Break the child and teach him to hate his parents.
The goal was to turn the boy into a living piece of propaganda.
That's it exactly. And the methods were just pure psychological torture.
How did they do it?
Deprivation, for one. Hunger was a constant tool, relentless verbal abuse, and they forced him into these performances. He was an 8-year-old boy, forced to learn obscene songs and crude phrases about his own mother and his dead father.
They even gave him alcohol.
Encouraged him to drink, to behave in ways that would completely break down his sense of self. He was being conditioned to testify.
And the state used that testimony, didn't they? They confronted the Queen with statements from her own son.
Yes. Forced statements full of impossible, monstrous acts that a child his age couldn't even comprehend, let alone describe.
But they didn't need to be true. They just needed to be plausible enough for a public that already wanted to believe the worst.
Precisely. They were convenient political tools. And the fact that they came from her own son, the heir to the throne, it was devastating. It converted this profound family wound into what looked like irrefutable state propaganda.
And after they were done with him, what happened to the boy?
His fate is maybe the deepest indictment of the whole system. Once he'd served his purpose, he was essentially thrown away, neglected.
Oh, how so?
He was confined to a small, filthy room, often left alone for long periods. He just wasted away. He died in custody at the age of 10. A combination of things. The records point to neglect, abuse, tuberculosis, and chronic malnutrition. He was a shell of himself.
A child destroyed by the state after being used for its political ends.
And there's one last grim detail that sort of binds it all together. After he died, a doctor secretly preserved his heart.
His heart?
Yes, and it survived for decades, passed down through different hands. It's this one physical trace of the boy, a powerful symbol of this familial destruction that outlasted the regime that caused it. So after they had systematically destroyed her family and her health in the temple, they moved her.
To her final destination, the Conciergerie.
Mm-hmm.
And if the temple was bad, the Conciergerie was something else entirely. It was basically the waiting room for the guillotine.
It was significantly worse. Her cell was below ground level. The stones were constantly damp. The records are full of references to the smell, sewage, decay, filth that you just couldn't escape.
And these conditions just accelerated her physical decline.
Rapidly. But the biggest change was the surveillance. It went from just supervision to total inescapable observation.
This is where they posted guards inside her cell.
Behind a screen, yes, 2 guards at all times. This wasn't about preventing escape. This was about eliminating privacy. Every single bodily function, washing, dressing, using the chamber pot, it all became a public scene.
It was institutional humiliation designed to strip away any last shred of dignity.
To make her nothing more than a body.
And the physical toll must have been obvious.
It was. Her clothes were hanging off her. She lost a lot of weight. And critically, that persistent bleeding we mentioned, it continued, completely untreated.
Which brings us to what modern historians suspect was really going on.
Right. Looking back at all the symptoms, the chronic pain, the anemia, the hemorrhaging, the consensus now is that she was very likely suffering from a progressive tumor, probably cervical cancer.
So on top of everything else, she was battling a terminal illness.
An agonizing one. And that illness, the pain and the weakness, directly impaired her cognitive function. It made it impossible for her to mount a clear defense later on.
So the state wasn't just letting her die. They were ensuring her decline would look like guilt.
And the cruelty became even more personal. The guards, They felt licensed to do whatever they wanted.
This is where the targeted sexual harassment comes in.
Yes. The records named specific men. A young guard named Gilbert who would ask her lewd questions, who offered to help her wash herself.
In exchange for favors.
Exactly. Another, Dufresne, was named as an accomplice in the constant mockery. When she tried to set boundaries, they just threatened her. The whole system was designed to make her powerless.
But amid all of this methodical destruction, there's this one small counter-narrative. A servant named Rosalie.
Rosalie is this incredible flicker of humanity in the darkness. She was assigned to clean the cell, and her acts were discreet and almost furtive.
Small acts of rebellion.
Tiny acts of rebellion. Bringing a piece of soap, a clean bandage, changing soiled linens when the guards weren't looking too closely.
Why was that so important?
Because, as the sources say, those 20 minutes of human contact restored a sense of personhood. They reminded her she was a human being. There's this incredible moment Rosalie recorded where she washed the queen's feet when the guards were distracted. And Marie Antoinette, who had never known anything but the highest protocol, just cried openly.
It was a final moment of human connection.
Exactly. And Rosalie's testimony later was so crucial. She gave details about the physical suffering, the blood, the wounds that completely countered the state's propaganda. Her small, quiet acts of care left a record of the truth.
So as her physical and psychological ruin reaches its peak, the revolutionary justice system moves in to make it all official. The trial.
And this was justice as spectacle. It was all about speed and performative violence.
Speedy conclusion and exemplary punishment.
Right. The trials were short. The evidence was often just rumor or coerced testimony, as we saw with her son. This wasn't about finding the truth. It was a theatrical production.
And the prosecutor. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was a true believer.
Oh, he'd built his entire career on this moment. He had gone from writing inflammatory pamphlets to being the man who would prosecute the queen. He embodied the political nature of the whole process.
And they saved their most powerful weapon for the courtroom stage.
The incest charge. It was deployed for maximum dramatic effect. When the clerk read out her son's forced statement, there was apparently an audible gasp in the courtroom.
A wave of shock and revulsion.
And for a moment, it almost backfired. It was so monstrous that some of the women in the gallery actually started to weep for her.
And that gave her an opening. Her only real opening.
She seized it. She stopped speaking to the court and turned directly to the women in the gallery.
And she appealed to them as mothers.
Yes. She asked them to consider whether any mother could commit such acts. It was this raw human appeal that for a second cut through everything. The records say there was a genuine pause, a moment of real tension.
That it wasn't enough.
The political momentum was too strong. The court quickly regained control, and the trial moved on to its predetermined conclusion.
And her actual legal defense was completely crippled from the start.
It was. Her counsel was minimal, restricted. She tried to give a calm, rational account of events. But the trauma, the illness, the exhaustion...
She faltered.
She faltered on dates, on names, and the prosecutors pounced on every single lapse.
It was the final step of that strategy. Degrade her, then use the degradation as evidence.
Perfectly executed. Her confusion wasn't seen as a symptom of her abuse. It was framed as proof of her guilt. The verdict was never in doubt.
Because it wasn't about justice. It was a performance.
The verdict guilty was a political signal. It was a message to anyone who might still defend the old order. No one is safe. The execution wasn't just a punishment. It was the final scene of the play they had been writing for months. The last 24 hours were all about maximizing the humiliation, making her death the ultimate symbol of revolutionary leveling.
It started with the preparation itself.
Right. The executioner came and roughly cut her hair. This wasn't just practical. It was about stripping away her last shell of status, that famous aristocratic coiffure.
And then they put her in a simple white dress.
The standard costume of the condemned. A final act of enforced anonymity, making her just another body for the state.
And the journey to the scaffold. That was also part of the spectacle.
Meticulously planned for maximum public exposure, she wasn't taken in a closed carriage. She was put in a plain, open cart, a tombereau.
A visual statement.
A powerful one. The route was packed with onlookers, screaming insults, jeering. The vendors, they treated it like a holiday, a market day of sensation.
And for her, passing all these landmarks she knew, the Tuileries, the Louvre, it must have been this painful catalog of her lost life.
The contrast between her arrival in Paris as a princess and this final hostile procession, It's just crushing to imagine. And yet, even then, there's one final bizarre moment of irony at the scaffold.
Her last words.
Her last words were an apology to the executioner for accidentally stepping on his foot.
That's incredible.
It is. Even in that final, brutal moment, the force of a lifetime of court manners, of rigid protocol, it just persisted. A tiny, absurd remnant of a world that was being violently erased.
And after the execution, the politics didn't stop. They moved on to her memory, starting with the burial.
There was no ceremony. Her body was thrown into a common pit in the Madeleine Cemetery, uncoffined, covered with quicklime.
This was intentional.
Very intentional. The goal was to prevent any kind of memorial, any pilgrimage site, to underscore that revolutionary leveling. For years, the exact spot was deliberately obscured.
But with royalty, the physical traces never quite disappear.
They never do. Decades later, when the monarchy was restored, there were these huge, politically charged efforts to find and reclaim the remains.
Was it really them?
It's still debated. The identification was questionable. But the symbolic act was what mattered. The reburial in the royal basilica at Saint Denis was an attempt to restore dignity that the state had so violently tried to annihilate.
And so much of what we know, the really human details of the cruelty we owe to her surviving daughter.
Yes, Marie Therese. Her life was defined by this trauma, but her memoirs became an absolutely critical historical resource. She wrote with this desperate need to correct the propaganda, to detail the specific abuses, the psychological torment. Her personal testimony is one of the main reasons we can reconstruct what really happened.
Which brings us to the final grim irony of the story, the cycle of vengeance.
The tragedy of any political project built on purges. The very men who orchestrated this, the prosecutor, the propagandists, most of them didn't survive the system they created.
They were consumed by it.
The internal purges, the shifting alliances, they were swept up and faced the same revolutionary justice they had perfected on others.
It shows how unstable that kind of system is.
It shows that a system that prioritizes vengeance over procedure has no logical place to stop. The definition of the enemy just keeps expanding until it turns on itself. So when you look back at all the evidence, the calculated deprivation, the total surveillance, weaponizing her own child, the harassment in that final cell, the conclusion is really unavoidable.
This wasn't an accident of history.
No. Marie Antoinette's suffering was a rigorous, highly visible political project. It was defined by calculated, institutional cruelty.
You quoted a source earlier that I think sums it perfectly. The slow, calculated ruin of a person before the final act is the central horror.
That's it. The system used law, rumor, and spectacle not just to kill a monarch, but to achieve this profound, irreversible break with the past.
And the rhetoric was always about virtue, about creating a new moral order.
While the methods were grounded in a kind of bureaucratic brutality, this cruelty was reproducible. It shows how a political goal, especially one that requires a total rupture, can just eclipse every legal and human norm.
So beyond the history, what does this case really show us? For you, the listener, I think it's deeply prescriptive. It's a case study in how legal systems that prioritize popular will over procedural safeguards.
Expedited trials, coerced testimony.
You don't just risk making a mistake, they create the perfect conditions for systematic, intentional abuse.
And yet, even as the machine does its best to crush every piece of humanity, that essential human core, it persists. The trauma, the dignity, the small acts of mercy, like Rosalie's, they create a counter-narrative that survives.
Which leaves us with a final, I think, important thought for you to consider. When we look at any political project, past or present, and we examine the methods it uses against its perceived enemies, especially when those methods involve the intentional degradation of a person, how can we really assess the moral authority of that project? The historical trail of human devastation always provides a very stark and often tragic contrast to the political rhetoric of virtue.